All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Appreciate everyone being here at our second Drone Study Committee meeting. Appreciate Representative Prince, Representative Hightower for being here. Representative Watson is not going to be able to be here, but I believe Eddie is on the way. And our Senate colleague, Judson Hill, Chairman Hill, is also going to join us, and he's in traffic running a little bit late, so he'll be here shortly. But in the sake of time, we want to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everyone here. We had a good, productive, those of you who in the audience who were not here last meeting, we had a productive meeting with the FAA, our friends at Georgia Tech, and also a retired Rear Admiral from the military talking to us about where we've come with this technology. And recently, after that meeting, you've heard some announcements come out of Congress, I think, dealing with their concern about drones and near misses at our airports in the United States, and those reports keep coming in. And we also heard 2 weeks ago from the FAA that Walmart was reporting that they anticipated 1 million drones would be sold for Christmas presents this year. So we're going to continue to hear about this topic, I think. So I think we're in a very timely fashion as we address this as a House. Our first up today is, and the scope of today's meeting, just to let the members of the committee know, is to try to look at government use of drones, both law enforcement, non-law enforcement use of drones by state and local agencies, and to determine if there's anything we as a House and Senate need to do as far as legislation, restrictions, that type of thing, to allow our agencies to use them properly. And we're going to start off with the Association of County Commissioners, and Deborah Nesbitt's here, and we'll turn it over to her and let her introduce anyone she has with her that's going to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm Deborah Nesbitt with the Association of County Commissioners. Usually Sean Adams has been with y'all doing this, and Sean's wife just had a baby, so I got tapped to be in here today. I want to first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking on this important issue. We, too, have concerns about the use of drones as well. From the Association of County Commissioners perspective, from local government, I know you're going to have law enforcement, some of the sheriffs later, so I'm just going to speak to the non-law enforcement uses of the drones. Obviously, as usual, we really don't want to see any unfunded mandates, obviously, but we would like to maintain local control so that we at the local level can institute ordinances to allow the use or non-use of the drones on public lands at parks. We want to have the ability to control that and try to keep it contained on the public land. We also don't want to have so much regulation that we can't use the drones for local government in a way that promotes efficiency. We may be able to from our tax assessor, I just heard a fire alarm going off. I guess it's in the other building. Is there a drone over there making sure everything's okay? So at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that we preserve our local control. There are uses for drones at the local level, anywhere from surveying, GIS mapping in particular is one thing that we use it for already. And with me today, I'm going to turn it over. With me today, I have Jeff Simmons. He's with Quantum Spatial, and they are a company that does a lot of work with local governments to do GIS mapping. And they, of course, have some concerns and have dealt with this issue as well. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and then if you have any questions for me, I'll be over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I don't have anything prepared. I'm not exactly sure how I got into this. Dave Wills with ACCG, and I know each other from GICC committee meetings and that kind of thing. But certainly from my perspective, UAS and UAV technology, which we've been trained to use that term as opposed to drones on the private side because of the connotation that drone sort of that term brings up. But from our perspective, it certainly the technology is here, the technology is viable, but we understand the need to protect the privacy of citizens and the safety of the general population through the use of this technology. So, again, I don't necessarily have anything prepared today. I'm more than interested in helping with any questions you might have from a private sector perspective. That's my understanding as to how I got here. So if you have any questions of me or of my company, how we use the technology, my position with Quantum Spatial is I'm National Director of Sales for State and Local Government. So I work very closely with state and local government. I'm a Georgia native, done a lot of business in Georgia. My office is here on Indian Trail Road. So I'm very familiar with Georgia specifically. Again, grew up in Stevens County, currently live in Hall County, went to the University of Georgia. So I'm a native, and certainly it's important to me that our legislature take a look at the technology and make informed decisions on how it should be regulated. So in any way I can help, I'm happy to do that.
Let me ask you this, and maybe you can expound on this a little bit. Currently, I'm assuming your company has a Section 333 exemption from the FAA to be able to utilize drones to do GIS mapping. So the county I live in, for instance, Dawson County, if we wanted to update our GIS mapping, we could contract with your company, and instead of using the traditional piloted aircraft, you would could use a UAV to do that. One of the things that, and one of the reasons we want to hear from ACCG, GMA, and folks like you is we're possibly putting regulations in place, passing laws dealing with the restrictive use of drones, not flying maybe over private property or videotaping or photographing a private property without consent. There could be some unintended consequences to that. We have had a lot of complaints. I know as an individual, kind of a guy that's been out in front on this issue, I've gotten a lot of calls from people, and I know Sheriff Norton, who's not able to be here, has had some issues in his community. Private citizens calling, there's a drone flying over my backyard, my girls are out in the swimming pool, what can I do about it? And there's not a lot of things currently in Georgia law that can be done to stop that. So if we pass a law that says, for instance, like several states have done, that you cannot photograph or videotape private property without that person's permission and distribute those photographs, that could have an unintended consequence on folks like you because you are mapping areas and using photography. So I guess what we want to hear from is some of those concerns you might have, and making sure that if we pass legislation that your interests are looked after so that those good uses of drones are protected.
Certainly, and that's understandable. In addition to having a Section 333, which we do have, in order for us to fly UAS or a drone anywhere, we have to go through the COA process, or Certificate of Authorization, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So in order to do that, then we have to explain why we're going to be flying a drone and what we'll be doing with it, what the intended use of the data collected on that mission would be well before we could put anything airborne. So the commercial use of the technology is, from my perspective, the FAA already has regulation that would, from our perspective, we're going to follow, whereas maybe a hobbyist might not. So I think there's a clear distinction there between someone like us using it for commercial use and delivering our services to a city or a county or state government versus a hobbyist. And so we already have to go through a pretty extensive review of why we would be using that technology just through the current FAA regulations.
Right,
which I think is a good thing, by the way.
That's right, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, because we all understand what the FAA has done, what their regulations are. But what we want to be careful of is the state also has certain authority to restrict takeoff and landings in the state. So if the state passed a law that said you cannot take photographs of private property without that person's consent and distribute those photographs, that could have a negative impact on you, because you might be you might be protected under the FAA that you're doing everything they want, but the state has the ability to put additional restrictions on these things. So that's my concern. And,
sure.
And so what I'm trying to get to is I want to make sure that we understand exactly how you do your job, the scope of it, so that if we're writing legislation in the future, or if we're issuing a policy statement from this committee, that we're making sure that we understand that there needs to be some maybe, and I'm just speaking for myself, some possible exceptions to this, and so that's what I'm trying
right,
to do.
And so I would think that legitimate, bona fide contracted work with a local government would somewhat be the avenue by which we would operate ethically.
Okay.
I guess is now just to point it out, and it's kind of an interesting direction to go with this, but for instance, we currently, Quantum Spatial currently has a contract with the Georgia Mountains Regional Commission, which is coordinating with 26 counties in the state of Georgia for aerial imagery now. Now it's done from an airplane, fixed wing, and so from the standpoint of taking pictures from the air, that's been my career for 25 plus years, not using drone technology, but using fixed wing and in some cases helicopter-borne sensor technology. So a lot of the taking pictures of people's backyards, quite frankly, has been done routinely since the 40s and 50s when the technology became prevalent. But I understand the concern in terms of drones and their ability to fly low and maybe less, more stealth, and making sure that's regulated properly. But again, in terms of taking pictures of private property, that's ongoing. I mean, that's a practice in the science of photogrammetry that's been around for quite a while.
Right, but with the drone technology, we get more and more complaints on that issue. So, and it is something we're looking at, and that's why we wanted to give you the opportunity to come today, so there's not those unintended consequences.
Right.
Representative Hightower.
I appreciate that very much.
What type of report do you have to file with the FAA? You were saying then you had to let them know what you were doing, what uses you'll be using it for, because I understand that we've done pictures for a long time, and I don't have a problem with that. With a fixed wing, though, you got to keep up a certain rate of speed. You're going over people's house very quickly. There's not a lot of time you can spend there intruding on their privacy.
That's correct.
With these drones, you can sit there and hover, and they may not be able to see the drone or not. But tell me a little bit about the process and what y'all have to apply when y'all do this.
Okay, as the chairman mentioned before, the Section 333 is really the first step in that, and that gives us, and we have one of those, and that essentially gives us a blanket certificate of authority to fly 200 feet. Working with a legitimate certificate of authorizations, which is the second part of that. So. Getting the Section 333 is the first step with the FAA. The second step for us is getting that certificate of authorization, which will outline the use of the technology, the technology itself, and then the data that's collected during that mission. The other thing I failed to mention is there's also a certificate of airworthiness that you have to file with the FAA. To make sure that any aircraft that you're flying obviously is airworthy, and the technology is.
Can you fly without the certificate of authorization?
No, sir. No,
You can't.
not at all.
Okay.
Private industry cannot. Hobbyists can, and there are some restrictions on that, but I think it's referred to as civil use by the FAA. Civil use, what we would do, we absolutely have to have that certificate of authority to go airborne.
Representative Prince.
Yes, and I understand the portion about they're already taking photographs as it is. But however, when you come down to the drones, and we start talking individual uses, the kind you purchase at Walmart, you have a license. You are authorized, and your data is being reported back to someone
That is
who's
correct.
authorized. I think our issue mainly comes where you have the local, everyday Brian Prince guy going out and flying things. Do you have clients that are just individuals, or all of
No,
yours?
sir.
Okay.
Yeah, our clients would be typically federal, state, or local government. We do have utility clients that are investigating the drone technology. It's a great application. We currently have not done work utilizing a drone for utilities, but there's a lot of discussion about that right now. But typically, the work that we've done, again, first of all, is very limited. Everything's visual line of sight, so we're not talking about drones that can go off and go miles away from its operator. So visual line of sight is still a restriction on the use of our technology. So, but again, it's technology that's here. I think you guys are prudent in getting out in front of it and understanding it and regulating it, quite frankly, as a private citizen speaking. But again, there are restrictions now on the commercial use of the technology that I think are keep someone, a company like ours, a legitimate company, able to deliver our services to our clientele, but not putting us or allowing us a situation where we might be doing things unethical. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I hope you understand kind of where we're coming from, because several states have passed laws that regulate the use of drones and photography from drones. And if we do that and we don't specifically have some exemptions in there for certain companies, then it could have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're after, so that you're not having to come back and say you've put us out of business in Georgia using drones, and we have to go back and try to fix a problem that we didn't realize. And that's the purpose of this.
Well, my thank you from the private sector. We appreciate that. So.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions of Deborah or any other ACCG questions before we move on? It's Justin, Georgia Municipal Association. I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about this very important issue. Drones are currently being used by cartographers, law enforcement, and for agricultural applications. Those are what we, I guess, use those drones for the most often. And it's understandable why the legislature has an interest in promulgating rules and regulations that govern these. This is undoubtedly one of those cases where the technology has moved faster than the laws that govern the technology. But municipalities across the state are using drones for a plethora of reasons. Therefore, whatever rules and regulations the legislature comes up with, we would like local governments to still have the flexibility to provide services to our residents using drones. Some of the advantage that we see of using drones is drones can capture views from very unique vantage points. They can be used in areas that are difficult to be reached by a human being. For instance, when you have to look at the underside of a bridge or things of that nature, it's a lot more safe to get a drone under there and use the camera as opposed to using a person to do that. Drones can be used to gather infrastructure information to assess damages to roads, streets, and bridges, identify stress points, and determine areas of weakness. Imagine if you could deploy a drone in the instances, and let's look at South Carolina, for instance, in that storm. I don't know their capabilities and if they can fly in that type of weather, but if they can, we could have had drones could have been out there and taken a look at some of those roads, noticed that they were getting weaker, and identified a first responder or a member of the public safety to come and block off that road so many of those cars may not have been on those faltering roads at the time. They can be a cost-effective tool during search and rescue missions. Assist with city planning. In the past, urban designers have relied on 2D technology. With the drones, it makes it more accessible for three-dimensional images that can be rendered to scale. Traffic management is a huge thing a lot of people are looking at. As opposed to having fixed cameras at intersections, you can deploy a drone and you can see a greater area, and you can even have multiple cameras facing different directions as opposed to having multiple fixed cameras. They can identify areas of congestion and also offer alternate routes. And it's a great tool for video production to help market our wonderful cities, and that's probably the area that most of our cities are using drones for. A lot of our public information offices and our marketing, visitors, and convention bureaus are purchasing, renting, or using various companies to help capture some of those great shots to help market our cities. Some of our concerns are the obvious public safety risks that would occur from drones colliding with already flying objects, or drones colliding with each other pose a threat to not only other aerial objects but also people on the ground. Irresponsible drone users can use them to illegally surveil people on private property. And the gentleman that preceded me mentioned that, and I think we spoke about that at the last meeting as well. Can interfere with official air traffic, which is it has been a common problem in some other areas. And then the possibility of residents weaponizing drones is something that we are very concerned about. And the difficulty to ensure, there's definitely going to be a difficulty to ensure that citizens or residents are using the drones in the proper manner. There are laws that already exist, but it's very difficult to enforce. And in any case of a drone operator that's using it with any type of negligence or malice, we won't necessarily know who was operating the drone at the time and things of that nature, because they're not required to be registered or require permits or anything like that. But as this technology is emerging, and the use of drones will probably increase, and municipalities will find different reasons to use them, we would just like the flexibility to continue to use drones to provide our services for our cities. Right now, we're using them to monitor water sewer lines, our water treatment facilities, and things of that nature, and we would like to be able to continue using that. We would also like local control on the ability to pass ordinances to restrict drone usage at public events, in large gatherings, and on municipal property, and also in the vicinity of our utility plants and things of that nature. So those are just some of our concerns, and as we all learn more about this technology and the capabilities of it, I'm sure more concerns and more advantages will come. But if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. You hit on something ACCG also mentioned, and I've heard it several times, is the idea of you may have a park, for instance, in a city or a county that the city council, the commission are okay with drones flying maybe in a certain area, but in other places it's not a safe place to do that. So it sounds like you'd like the ability to regulate that locally, where if you wanted to limit the use on public land in your county, that your city that you own, you could do that. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And then the other thing that maybe some of our law enforcement folks can also speak about today, but we've heard stories in other states where major fire scenes, for instance, in California, where you have other drones that are not related to the emergency. They're being flown by just private individuals that are flying in and interfering with those scenes. And I could see that happening here in Atlanta or anywhere in our state, where drones you'd have a major accident scene. You've got a helicopter trying to land with live flight, for instance, or a fire where they're trying to drop water or other chemicals. So is that a concern that you've heard about?
That's a very real concern that we've heard about and we've discussed with certain members of our public safety. But there are some fine members of public safety that will be presenting later, and we'll let them address those issues.
One of the things, and you may not be familiar with this, but I'd heard yesterday that I think it was the city of Griffin there were some movie folks filming there, and they were having a major issue with some drones interfering with the movie set. And I've not really thought about that, because most of the time we hear from the movie industry, it's more they're using drones. They want to be able to use drones for the movies. But as we think about the paparazzi and the media and other folks that are coming in trying to take pictures of those sets that are filming all across the state, it's my understanding again that Griffin had a recent issue with that.
It was the city of Sonoya, and where they're filming The Walking Dead, and that has a crazy cult following, and there have been drones flying trying to see the sets and trying to capture information and all that stuff. So that has been a problem.
Okay.
That has very much been a problem.
So it sounds like that's one of the other things you hit on, was maybe giving the cities the ability to regulate some of those activities through ordinances possibly.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I'm sure the movie industry in Georgia would appreciate that also.
Right. Okay, any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda, I think we have left off right after this. We were supposed to hear from Director Keenan, so At this time, we'll ask our GBI Director, Vernon Keenan, to come forward and present to us.
Mr. Chairman, I have just a few brief comments, and I wanted to try to put some things in context here. Law enforcement understands very well the sensitivity of having new technology and combine that with the concerns of the public over privacy and civil liberties. It's something that law enforcement deals with routinely, but specifically to drones. We understand the talk about being concerned about using it for surveillance, for using it for collecting information improperly. But we do not want to see there be restrictions put in which would hamper law enforcement's ability to use this very useful tool. Because there are situations that it would be very important to law enforcement to be able to cover ground rapidly, to be able to collect appropriate information. Give you an example. Excuse me. Representative Hightower was recently out at GBI to see our bomb unit. It would be a very real situation to have a drone available to go down and look at a suspect package to see if it is explosive, as opposed to sending an agent downrange to be in close proximity of that. Now, there are 609 government agencies that have approval from the FAA to use drones, and many of those are law enforcement. The drones can keep officers out of dangerous places. They can allow us to cover ground rapidly. They can allow us to, and particularly in rural areas. So whatever we do here, and law enforcement is used to operating under restrictions, but what we want to do here is see that we maintain the capability to use this technology and to not be restricted to the point that it hampers us in the ability to protect the public.
Let me ask you this question, Director Keenan. Under emergency situations and that type of thing, but if you've got a situation, I'll just give you a scenario where you've got law enforcement has permission to use a drone, and I'm sure the FAA rules are going to continue to change. We're talking about that they've not been able to keep up with the technology, but you've got specific information that Brian Prince is got something going on in his backyard that he shouldn't have going on in his backyard. And normally, if we're going to go and send boots on the ground there, we're going to have a search warrant to go on the curtilage of his property. Now, if it's
Correct.
Open fields and it's out in the middle of the woods, that's probably a different scenario. But what's your thoughts on whether or not the state should require a search warrant if you're on the curtilage of the property looking for specific evidence in a non-emergency type related case?
I have no problem with that requirement because we already must have a search warrant to go on property to do a crime scene examination. This would be just an extension of that requirement, to my view, as opposed to saying you cannot use a drone under any circumstances. Right. But to have legal restrictions is something acceptable to law enforcement we routinely deal with. If we go to a residence and there's to be a crime scene examination, then we get a warrant ahead of time. Now, what we have to be careful with is those situations where we're not collecting information specific to a criminal investigation or target. If we're doing a search mission, then I don't know that a warrant is necessary there. And there will be many times where there's going to be exigent circumstances that we're not going to be able to get a warrant. And we need to have exemptions for that. But if we center in on collection of evidence of criminal activity at a specific location, then I have no problem with there being a warrant requirement. That's reasonable. I think the public accepts that.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Director.
Okay.
All right. Next is the Georgia Chiefs of Police. Frank Rotunda, the Executive Director.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And committee members, my name is Frank Vincent Rotundo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police. Actually, when Representative Tanner mentioned that he would like me to come up and speak a couple of minutes about drones, I realized I wasn't a subject matter expert, so I immediately sent out a little email to some of the leaders in the association. They came back with some of the ideas which have already been mentioned here, the real need for drones in law enforcement. Director Keenan was also kind enough to mention that we absolutely have no problem with search warrants as they currently stand now, but we don't want to be handicapped under those exigent circumstance situations. And we also are very concerned about making sure that we have the drones available to save staffing. And with that in mind, I have a litany of things that I could tell you that we could use drones for, but I made an outreach to Atlanta Police Department, and I happen to have the Assistant Police Chief of Atlanta Police Department here with me, Chief Jones. Chief Jones wants to make a couple of statements because, as you probably surmise, one of the key reasons why drones should be used in law enforcement would be for crowds, and where they have most of the crowds are in Atlanta. So, Chief, it's yours. Thank you.
All right, good morning. All right, Sean Jones, Assistant Chief of Police, City of Atlanta Police Department. And it's something that we've really been looking at for a number of years, how we can employ drones to be able to better do our job. Each year, we have about 42 million people coming to the city of Atlanta for various reasons. The Peachtree Road Race is one of the biggest events that we host in our city. And, of course, we know what is happening in Boston in the future. And just really having a good line of sight. It's our job to try to make sure that we can keep the public as safe as we possibly can, mitigating situations even before they can begin to happen by having eyes on the ground, similar to flying a helicopter. Helicopters flying those are really expensive for agencies for the most part, but the drones would give us the ability to perform similar type functions and have an aerial view of what's going on the ground. Crowd control is one of those issues that we think that would help us definitely as it relates to drones. Another area that I think is key when you start talking about using drones is missing persons. People with Alzheimer's and different mental diseases go missing every day. A lot of times we find them in areas that we can't get to necessarily by foot, or we wouldn't be able to get to easily. Those drones gives us the ability to be able to search those areas that we may miss. And unfortunately, if we miss that, then that's someone's life. That's someone's relative that's out there that we might miss in that particular process. So it gives us the ability to do those searches. Quite naturally, from a crime fighting standpoint, it helps us as well in terms of being able to fight crime. But we have no issues with search warrants. We want to make sure that everything that we do with the drones is legal, and whatever regulations you think we would need to have, we think those we put in place. But I think as we continue to move to the future, drones, when you look at the military, they're using drones. They've been very effective at it. We can take some of the things that they do, translate it into law enforcement, and make it work for us as well. But really, crowd management, missing persons. When Director Keenan talked about the hazmat piece, there are various components that go on there, on those drones that can go down range, identify what the chemical would be or what the hazard would be, and it keeps our officers safe. We know what to do immediately going in without wasting time trying to figure it out. The drone helps us expedite that particular determination of what's going on. So we believe that if we had this in all these situations, we believe that it's going to make law enforcement of the future is where we're going, but it makes things safe for just the public and law enforcement officers as well. So we do believe that drones would be beneficial in our law enforcement environment. Thank you.
Chief, let me ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
One of the things, the City of Atlanta has a lot of area that you're responsible for that's critical infrastructure.
Right.
And I know that you've got Hartsfield Airport, and the FAA has certain rules about not flying so closely to the airport. We've got the state capitol here that is in the City of Atlanta. That the building authority has issued some rules about not having drones fly in certain areas.
Right.
What's your thoughts about the ability of the state or local agencies, local governing agencies, to be able to restrict drone takeoffs and landings and flying in certain areas around critical infrastructure?
Well, definitely around critical infrastructure, we think it's important that drones don't do that, especially around the airport. You got as the aircraft are going across, landing, it poses a significant danger for them. In terms of some of the buildings, downtown, it may be necessary for law enforcement, but definitely not for people who may be doing their own private drones in order to deal with a law enforcement related incident. I believe that we need to have that ability to be able to do that. Just like we would fly helicopters over the area, whether it's Georgia GSP or whether it's us flying our helicopters to see and manage whatever is going on in the area. So it just gives us another alternative in the event the pilot is not readily available from a helicopter standpoint.
Because the way I kind of look at this issue, you've got two sides. You've got the law enforcement use of drones,
Right.
but you also have the public safety sector side of where private citizens are using drones, maybe
Right.
completely within the realm of the FAA. They're novice and they're flying drones and they're in an area they can fly, but all of a sudden you've got a crime scene or all of a sudden you've got an emergency and those drones are interfering with your ability to do your job.
Right.
And wanting to make sure as we look at this, we as a state give you the ability, and again I'm speaking for myself, give you
Right.
the ability to protect that crime scene or that emergency that you normally might not have to keep those novice and those drones away from the scene.
Right. We definitely want to keep the novice flyers of the drones away from the scenes. They interrupt and interfere with the operation, what we're trying to do. One area that we've seen them and we have to deal with an internal field where they fly over some of the areas while the games are going on, posing a significant danger. You know, we're talking about our new dome that's coming into existence. Well, it's going to have an open piece. Well, if they fly the zone there and they lose power, it's going to fall. It'll fall. It can damage, hurt individuals out there. So we definitely need to make sure that there's some regulation as it relates to the private use of drones.
And the other thing too, I think that because we hear a lot about the FAA and they testified 2 weeks ago, their ability is through a civil fine. They give you a civil fine. So if you've got someone who's flying too close to the stadium,
Right.
it's in violation of FAA rules, but they're still doing it. It's not something you necessarily can act immediately on. You
Right.
call the FAA,
Right.
they track the person down, they tell them not to do it again, or they give them a civil fine. So my concern is that maybe we need to consider as a state giving some ability for agencies to be able to restrict that behavior. Maybe some of it should be criminal, possibly, and that's one of the things we want to look at. And the other question I have for you, and someone mentioned this earlier, but we've heard some other states have passed legislation already prohibiting this behavior,
Right.
where you weaponize or an individual puts a weapon onto a drone.
Right.
Now, they may be doing it on their own property.
Right.
They may be doing it on property with permission. But what are your thoughts about a private citizen being able to equip a drone with a weapon?
Well, I mean, really it poses a danger to everyone once the drone gets up, starts flying. That's one way that, you can engage in terroristic type activity. So I would oppose the fact that you would be able to weaponize a drone. We would
Right.
oppose that.
Okay. Are there any other questions of the chief? What number are you, 15?
Just from a practical perspective, we can pass laws. Laws already exist. How do you go about identifying and prosecuting those folks that might perpetrate a crime with the use of a drone?
So great question. So typically, let's say we've had a few incidents involving internal field. And keep in mind, as it relates to the use of the drone, most of the drones are line of sight, which means the person has to be in close proximity. We've been able to identify those individuals who were perpetrating those acts and get them to stop doing that. So they're easily defined because of the line of sight. So they're not too far distant from where the drone is being flown.
All right. Any other questions? All right, Chief. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for allowing the Assistant Police Chief to speak. I do have another member of the law enforcement community who's been exploring drones in their own city, Chief Grogan, if you wish to hear from him. But one thing I would like to mention is that one of the notes brought to my attention is a very real note, and I'm very worried about staffing issues always for law enforcement purposes. And the patrolling aspect of a drone could save a lot of staffing hours, particularly during Christmas time, when you can patrol parking lots and crime-ridden areas, perhaps breaking into cars. So it's really a very proactive approach for law enforcement to use that. But I'm going to leave this podium area with a thought that was given to me this morning, that Christmas is coming, and there will be a lot of drones under people's Christmas trees. So I appreciate you kind of being proactive in addressing this issue. The numbers are staggering as to what they expect under people's Christmas trees this year as far as the amount of drones. I heard a number that gave me kind of chills. Could be 1 million. And I don't doubt it because they're produced for $50 now, and you could add cameras to them. So thank you very much. Chief Grogan, did you have anything to add? Thank you.
Just a couple of observations based on some of the other comments. I certainly agree with Chief Jones and some of the others who have talked about the drones. Let me kind of give you a good example about the issue about privacy, which I think is always a big concern of everyone. So I think the prudent way to act would be if there's an expectation of privacy for the person, say they've got a fenced-in backyard and we can't readily see it, then we would need a search warrant to use a drone to see what we can't normally see. But there's an exception to that, and I'll give you this example. Sean mentioned looking for Alzheimer person that's lost. So if you've got an area where you're looking for an Alzheimer person, a lost person, and you want to fly a drone in the air, you may fly over people's backyards that are fenced in, but you want to be able to check to make sure that that person is not in the yard. And we know through many years that a lot of the patients that get lost end up dying if they get stuck somewhere, in the woods or fall down and hurt themselves. And so it's an ability to be able to search for those individuals, I think, that you'd want to fly over maybe yards and that sort of thing. Also, when you're talking about a crime scene, I think it would be prudent, again, to be able to restrict private drones from being able to fly over the area. And one of the main reasons, obviously, is to prevent them, keep them from interfering with what we're trying to do. But in addition to that, I think it's a public safety issue. It could put our officers at risk if, say, there's a barricaded suspect and it's a SWAT operation. You don't obviously want the location and exactly the details of what you're doing to be someone to be able to see or broadcast, and certainly that's important. And the last comment is, I think it was touched on by one speaker, but one of the big benefits, or two big benefits of having a drone from a law enforcement perspective is training. And so we can, have an event that we can film and then look at it afterwards and review how we conducted ourselves, and whether it's a real-life event or whether it's a training session, we want to review it. And then also for community outreach, to be able to record the things that, the good things that are going on in the community that we're participating in, and use it to put together, for lack of a better word, promotional videos or whatever of the event, showing the police department and the community working together. So I think that's helpful as well. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I've noticed several other states have had the concept of if there's an expectation of privacy, you have to get a search warrant, and I think that's a good policy. I think one of the things that's a little different is traditionally we've been able to use helicopters or airplanes. You could fly over and wouldn't have to have a search warrant even if someone had their backyard fenced. So of course drones bring a whole new concept to that, because you fly lower, it's more stealth. The people's feeling of maybe their privacy being invaded is greater with that versus an airplane flying over. So it sounds like from your personal perspective, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think that's the same thing I heard from Director Keenan and from the Chiefs Association, was if you're going to a specific house looking for specific evidence, and normally there would be an expectation of privacy in that backyard, that you would have no issue with a search warrant being required, as long as there were exceptions to that, like if there's extenuating circumstances, you're looking for an Alzheimer's patient, you're looking for a fugitive, and you're flying not that specific location, you're just in that area looking for that victim or that perpetrator. But if you're going there for that specific reason, that you wouldn't be opposed to that.
That's correct.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Frank, anything else?
No, sir.
All right. Thank you for being here. All right. Next we have Terry Norris with the Georgia Sheriff's Association.
Morning.
I think this computer's as old as the Capitol.
I'm sorry?
I think the computer's as old as the Capitol. So
Okay, well,
just
we'll
be
have to talk to
patient.
Sheriff Whittle about that.
Let me say this while we're waiting on them to get the equipment fixed. There's a sign-up sheet here on the corner. If anyone is here that from the public that would like to be heard at the end of the meeting before we adjourn, we have a public sign-up sheet, and there's a few folks that signed it, but please do that if you're interested. Also, we welcome Chairman Hill is with us. Thank you for being here.
Because Sheriff Whittle's going to handle this, so you'll have to explain it to him in just a minute, so stand by. Mr. Chairman, if I may begin, Sheriff Whittle's actually going to come up in a second, but you've given me the role this morning that I could absolutely handle, and that is to introduce some folks. And I just, very quickly, Sheriff Steve Wilson is in the back. He's our president of the Sheriff's Association of Walker County. We have Sheriff Howard Sills here from Putnam County, many of y'all know, past president. And we have Sheriff Clay Whittle with us that's going to talk a little bit about drone usage in the Columbia County Sheriff's Office. All three of these guys have around 40 years of experience, so they didn't just show up today and make whatever they say up. But Sheriff Nick Norton was one that you particularly had wanted to come today. He is unable to be here. He has some issue in the county and could not come. He was going to talk about a case made against an individual that had improperly used drones. So he had asked that I suggest to you that if there's another meeting he can come to, that he wanted to do so. So maybe we can follow up with that. So.
Yeah, and let me just, Sheriff Norton had reached out to me, and Terry and I had talked about this. He had a concern, and we've heard this from several other sheriffs across the state, where it was a private individual using a drone to harass or to spy or to surveil a neighbor or someone in the community, and was concerned about the limited ability that law enforcement had to be able to intervene in those situations, and wanted us to hear that concern as a committee. And as we think about policy and legislation, giving law enforcement the tools they need if someone has that issue to be able to act. So I think that it's not the specific case, but that's generally what his concerns was. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Sheriff Clay Whittle is from Columbia County. He's, I think they got about 150,000 folks in there. Clay's been sheriff since April '95, and he probably was a deputy when he was a little boy. You know, his family kind of started sheriffing for a long time ago.
You just mash the right and left arrows.
I got a guy that's smart about that stuff. I'll call him up here.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to take up a lot of your time this morning. We had actually brought a PowerPoint presentation. If you want to see it, Staff Sergeant Gary Harden would be more than happy to show it to you. Basically outlines the UAV program and the parameters involved in that. We use this in our training at the local regional academy in the Augusta area. If you want to see it, I'd be more than happy to have him come up here. I applaud you, like everyone else has said today. You got to be out front on this. These tools are a great benefit to the government, whether it's local cities, counties, or the law enforcement. It's something we don't need to be hampered on. I think most of it's been covered as far as the direction you want to go in that. We have rules of evidence that we all have to follow in law enforcement, and I think if we look at those and pattern anything you may write in a law after the normal rules of evidence, it'll pretty much cover most of those areas. I don't think any law enforcement would have trouble wanting to get search warrants or anything of that nature for stuff that is not in emergency or exigent circumstances. And I think, again, if we just follow the rules of evidence that we have now in Georgia law and kind of use that as a guideline of where you want to go on the law enforcement side, I think all law enforcement will be okay with that. I know we certainly are. Our policy within the sheriff's office dictates, even if we're out on a call with our units that we have searching for a lost child or searching for an Alzheimer's patient, things that we've done in the past, if we fly over somebody's yard like the chief said from Dunwoody, we don't keep that information. Although it's on the screen and it can be recorded as we're flying, our rules say we don't keep that information, just as we would do if we were on foot looking in those neighborhoods and looking for those lost children or those Alzheimer's patients in the same way. But the value of having information like that under law enforcement as far as actual cases are concerned, I think are prominent and can simply be controlled by the rules of evidence that we have currently in the state laws. And anything we pass could probably be used as a guidance of how to write those laws as far as law enforcement is concerned. I will touch on the private side of this. We have an area in Columbia County, and we actually built our government building around an area that used to be an old farm field. And that farm field, when it was privately owned, used to be a place that people brought model airplanes to fly in. And as it got busier and busier in that area of our county, our government bought most of the property and ultimately bought that field, and that's where we have an outdoor amphitheater now that's called the Lady Antebellum Amphitheater. You know about it, obviously. They're hometown boys from Columbia County, and we named it after them, and they've been there to perform, and we have large performances there all the time. We don't have model airplanes there anymore, and that place is such a popular attraction for the people of Columbia County, not to mention when we have big concerts there, that we do need the ability to put restrictions on those kind of areas now, because there's all sorts of folks out there with nefarious purposes that'll be coming to places like that all across the state of Georgia. And I agree, local entities certainly need to be able to have city ordinances or county ordinances to be able to govern who can fly in those areas and who cannot. I'm going to quit talking for a little bit. If you would like, I'll have him do this PowerPoint. If you don't, we can move on however you want to, Mr.
No, that's great. Let me ask you one question, Sheriff.
Yes, sir.
You hit on something I thought was an interesting point. As we hear from people concerned about their privacy and about there's a concern in the day and time we live in about the government having too much information and keeping documentation and videos and photographs. So it's interesting that you yourself has self-restricted your agency, that if you're flying over, if you're looking for that lost child and you're flying over my house, and you're using that video camera to guide yourself, that once that operation's over with, you don't keep that video from. Right. That's interesting, and I think that would give people some comfort that you're using it for a legitimate purpose, you're using it for an emergency, but you're not just using it as a way to document people's private property.
My private property is in Columbia County like everybody else's is, and I don't want folks flying drones over my house if they don't have a legitimate purpose for it.
Right. It's interesting. Yeah, but yes, Sheriff, we'd love to. I think Senator Hill has a question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here, and it's following up on the chairman's question. I believe you said you have rules in place about how you retain those images.
Yes, sir.
Is that true?
Yes, sir.
Is there any thing stated in the law about how long we do that? And if not, what would your recommendation be on a reasonable amount of time? I mean, I know you're just speaking as one sheriff in the state, but that'd be something probably good to hear from the law enforcement community. What would be a wise, reasonable amount of time balancing the interest of law enforcement versus the interest,
again,
the
I
competing
think
interest?
We already have laws in place about storage of items that we collect as a law enforcement agency now in Georgia, just like our retention laws about all of our public documents, whether it's an accident report, an incident report, a witness statement form, or anything of that nature. I think we need to simply look at those laws that are already in place and use those as the template to add to the UAV law so that we model ourselves after what we already conduct in Georgia, because I think the laws we have now currently in Georgia are acceptable.
Let me follow up on that. And I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't know if our council knows the answer to this question or not, but if your law enforcement agency has a Section 333 well, this is called something else for law enforcement, but you have the ability to fly a drone, you're looking for a lost child, would the law, I don't know that the law would currently require, if they're flying over an area, that they would be prohibited from keeping that video currently. It sounds like, but it sounds like your question and kind of what you said is you wouldn't be opposed to,
correct,
if there was laws that said if you're on an emergency, extenuating circumstances, whatever the case might be, that there could be some restrictions placed on that imagery will not be maintained by the government. It would be done away with if it had nothing to do with the mission you're currently on.
Right, and that's the reason I say use the laws that we have in place as far as rules of evidence and things, and now to tag onto that, because if it has evidentiary value, we certainly want to keep it, and the laws govern how we do that now. If it doesn't have any value like that, I have no need to keep it. That's why if I'm flying looking for a child, or we're simply transiting one location and we have to cross the property boundaries of a private individual, I have no reason to keep that video footage of his land just because we traversed his land to get to the target point that we are working on. So I think it should be just simply deleted. Because if you don't, if you hold that in your property, then it becomes part of the rules on how you store and what you store here in Georgia. It also becomes an open records issue. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons we don't want to keep it, because that becomes a nightmare when you start talking about open records of all the video that you could possibly have simply because you were flying from point A to point B and you got it on video under Georgia law. If you kept that, now you go into the retention schedules. And then it also goes into, again, the sunshine laws for people to do freedom of information requests. And that's where our money is always tied up in issues like this, is having to try and keep up with all those information requests and have them processed by the public. So we don't see a need to keep that type of stuff.
And that's one of the concerns that we've heard, I've heard too, is that not just that the law enforcement agency would have the video, but someone else could come in and say, I want to get the video from this house, and some private citizen would not have access to it. So, Judson.
Just to follow up on that, just getting in the weeds too, so do y'all self-edit that information, the video of what is relevant versus what is gathered as evidence?
Yes, sir. If it's not of any evidentiary value, we destroy it. We delete it and get rid of it.
So you edit through, because I would think you'd have an ongoing tape of video. Are the rules, to your knowledge, are the rules the same across, for Sheriff's Department or for law enforcement, GBI?
No, sir. That is rules inside the Columbia County Sheriff's Office.
So would you think that if we made a wise decision at the legislative level, that we should consider helping y'all have some consistency in that rulemaking for non-evidentiary
I have no
videos?
problem with that. I have no problem with that.
And Sheriff, we'll let you turn it over to your staff, but I want to say to you, I appreciate you being here, and we've heard great things about you and your agency from Terry Norris, and I think we've got one other question. I think he's going to cover it in his presentation. Oh, okay.
Yes, sir. Okay. This is Staff Sergeant Gary Harden. He is in charge of our UAV program here in Columbia County, and he'll just go through this briefly. Feel free to ask him, stop him any this point. He's most definitely our subject matter expert here.
I'm sure it'll freeze up for you. I always want to install updates at the most inopportune time.
We don't have to run next month.
Usually you can postpone it. Evidently I don't have that ability. You've got to be kidding.
If any member, Mr. Chairman, if any member would like a
Well, I
copy of this,
apologize. I'm just going to let it restart.
to you.
Yeah.
I think we have it right here. But the digits maybe.
Yes, I think everyone has one in their folder. So we got. Thank you.
You just want to go through it. I'm just going to let this restart. We got a little technology.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
I'm Staff Sergeant Gary Harden, Columbia County Sheriff's Office, SOD Division, and I'm the head of the UAV program for Columbia County. I've been a licensed pilot for over 30 years. I've looked at the drones. We like to call them UAVs. Drones, more of a military term. People, when you say drone, they're looking at this big gray airplane with nobody in it with bombs hanging off the wings. UAV is a smaller unit. It does not as much as what a drone would do. The packages that we have are DJI Phantom products. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. DJI is about the 70% holder of all the sales of UAVs around the world. It's a big organization. Some of the equipment that we've bought, which is about a year old, I personally bought one recently, and the time that we bought the older units till now, the technology's advanced at least 5 years. They've gone from a GoPro camera to a 4K camera. And if you understand what 4K camera is, that's ultra high def. If you go to Best Buy and see a 4K TV, you look at it and you go, holy Jesus. It's so clear you can see blades of grass 100 yards away. It's so clear. That type of technology gives us the ability to get information from the air in an area that we may miss something. When we deploy for training, we use a 20-inch monitor connected to the ground station, which also has a tablet. I can tell that drone where to go, or the UAV, where to go in reference to the Google Earth map that's on our tablet. I can stay away from areas that we don't need to be in. We can be very precise with it because it has dual GPS capabilities, the U.S. American made plus the GLONASS European. So we're getting real finite with our areas that we're looking. We did some training with some of my guys. We have about 8 pilots on board. And what we did, we have a large bit of acreage behind our office, and we took a dummy body out in the field. And the scenario was we got an Alzheimer's patient that's been missing for 2 weeks. Of course, 2 weeks, you know that it's not going to be a search and rescue. It's going to be more or less, you know, like recovery. So the guys found the body right off the bat pretty quickly. We were flying at an altitude of about 200 feet, which maximum altitude the FAA allows for UAVs is 400. Now, they found the body. We did videos. We critiqued it. What do you do? What kind of search patterns do you use and whatnot? We train these guys every month. We try and do it at least 6 hours a day for 2 days each month. They're getting very good with it. They've been very precise with it. First thing we do when we go out on the scene, safety. Make sure we don't have anybody that's standing around. We make it what we call a safe zone for our operators. We have observers that are put out in the field. We have two-way radios that we can contact each other on a private channel. When the drone is in the air, we work them by line of sight. If it gets behind a tree set, which you know in Georgia we got a lot of trees, a lot of tall trees, the observer can tell us where we're at and where we're close and give us some information to, you know, we need to get 15 meters from this border or whatnot. We train that, like I say, all the time. We work to keep the safety part of it is the first part. We don't want anybody getting hurt. Stay away from areas where large populations are. Now, there's going to be times that we'll probably have to use it, such as crowd control. Not as much as crowd control itself, but information. And we can do that not getting on top of the crowd. We can do that away from them. Like I say, the cameras pull a lot of information. They're high megapixel cameras. We can do all the editing on the fly, you know, zoom in on images and see what we have. The information that we get, right now, the training information anyway, we keep it for training purposes. Now, if we go out on a scene, a crime scene, search and rescue, whatever, depending on what it is, if it's for evidentiary value, it's burned to a disk and it's put in our evidence room. We don't need it. We see something that we're not part of, it's destroyed. We have videos that's captured by traffic cameras in the county, and we have a 72-hour hold on those videos. For any problems, let's say a traffic accident, and that information needs to go to the court, we keep it for 72 hours. Logistically, anything longer than that, we'd have to have a building full of hard drives to keep all the information on it. Excuse me. The resolution on these cameras is so high, a 20-minute video is about 18 gig. So you understand how much hard drive space that would use up. Now that's one flight. That's a 20-minute flight. You get into 6 hours of this, so you can imagine how much hard drive space we would need to keep all that video. But we don't need it. You train in different areas with it. Now, like I say, there may be some places, perhaps we had a fire at Marshall Place, it's a retirement community, and we flew over it to check for hot spots with a FLIR. The fire department's there, they got the ladders in there and they're pouring water on it, but they can't see down in the center what's going on with this fire because of the way the structure is made. There was a hot spot that we picked up on the FLIR, and we adjusted our camera angle and said, listen, you know, give the information to the fire department. You got a hot spot here, and it was pretty hard. By the time they hit it with the water, it was almost like a small explosion. Kept them guys from getting hurt. Keep them out of harm's way. One of the newer UAV that's fixing to come out is made by the same company, DJI. It's called an M100 Matrice. And what it has the capability of doing is flying inside a building. Now, the Matrice has an avoidance collision system on it that if you walk up to it, it'll back away from you. And right now we have it in R&D, one of the companies that we deal with. As soon as they tell us that they're out of the testing phase and we're going to go look at it, we're looking at possibly putting it in our inventory for active shooter situations in a school or a commercial building or whatnot. We've use the video from our system, which is what they call a light bridge video, which transmits all the video in digital format, so it goes through walls a lot better than it does in analog. We've tested it in 3-story buildings and did not lose video from the ground station outside to the unit inside the building, which we were walking around with handheld. It uses what they call a Light Bridge 2 series, which is a lot stronger. We'll be able to deploy this thing inside of a school, send it down a hallway wide open, get to where the shooter is quickly, identify a location, and then send personnel to take them down. This keeps us out of harm's way. We don't want to send somebody in, running down the hallway, and you don't know where this guy is. With the M100, it's got cameras around it. It won't hit the floor, won't hit the ceiling or walls. And if a student steps out of a hallway for some unknown reason, it'll stop. And you can see what's going on. It's robotics from the future coming in now. We've seen this stuff in movies years and years ago. Well, it's happening here and it's happening now. As far as the, I guess, the Fourth Amendment rights, people think that, well, you know, the airspace above my house belongs to me. Well, the FAA says no. That's navigable airspace. That's National Airspace System. GSP helicopters. If we were to put laws on that that's going to restrict us from flying above houses, what is the law enforcement aviation industry going to do about the helicopters? That's a lot of money, not be able to use them. Now, per our policy, if we have to fly over your house for any reason, we get a search warrant. That's it, bottom ground. We get a search warrant. We don't want to cross that line of your civil liberties by doing something unethical. And if one of my operators does that, he will not only face charges from our agency, but civilly as criminally. And these guys understand that very well. We don't play with that. But I don't, just like the sheriff says, I don't want one of those things flying over my houses. Now, having problems with people flying private-owned UAVs, we don't have that in our county yet. I haven't heard of. And I'm sure it's coming. I know, just like Atlanta around the airports. I think the biggest problem with the public is education. They don't know the rules and regulations of the FAA. That's the reason why they want a pilot on board your unit, because they understand. They go through ground school. They know the National Air Safety System. They know what vehicles can do. They know where you can fly and when you can't fly. The newer systems like the Phantom 3, it has software programmed in it. When I get to a no-fly zone, which is 5 miles from the center of the airport, it'll stop. It won't let me go in that no-fly zone. 398 feet, it stops. You can hold that throttle, full throttle. It won't go no higher than 398 feet. 400 foot is the ceiling, which is a good thing that DJI has done for this. But you got some UAVs that doesn't have that capability. Some of your older ones, some of your smaller ones. Some of the bigger ones, like the motion industry, picture industry use, those things go a mile up in the air, at least. Now, understanding that they know what they can and can't do with these, like your local airport, Augusta Regional is ours. I took all of my guys out and we talked to the supervisor at the tower. We sat down with him and said, listen, if we have something that happens within the 5-mile perimeter of your airport, Richmond County, we got a search and rescue, Alzheimer's patient, we got a body floating out there in Infinity Swamp we're looking for, what do we need to do? First thing is, we need your location. To be able to do that, you need an aviation sectional, which is a map of the airspace. If I handed one of you guys one now, you'd look at it and go, what is this? It's all these little circles and lines and stuff. If I hand one to a pilot, he knows exactly what it is. He knows where he's at. He knows exactly where he can tell the location. The easiest way to do it is with a GPS system, by using a radio navigational aid. We work off of VOR, which is goes into another technical realm, but we can give them that information. They can plot it on their scope, give us a 5-mile radius to 500 feet. We get a 100-foot buffer, for air, and they keep air traffic away from us. That way we can do our job. We don't have to stand around looking in the sky for an aircraft coming over when we're looking for an Alzheimer's patient, missing child, a body, whatever the case may be. We have a phone number. We can call them direct. They're open from 6 to midnight. Any time during that period, if we need to use it, we can call them. They'll keep air traffic out of our area. Safety, that's the biggest thing. Lost link, which is ground control station. We're flying. I fly the unit out. I get on the other side of some trees, and I lose the link, but my observer can see it. And this has happened. We test this stuff. We want to know what happens if this does happen. The unit we have has a button on it. When I lose link, I can push it, and it'll send a digital signal to that. Or if it loses radio connectivity whatsoever, it comes home. It will return to the point where it took off from. With those GPS, like the dual GPS systems I was telling you about, it'll sit right there in the exact same spot it took off from. It goes up to a predetermined altitude, which we set at 200 feet. That's to clear any towers, any trees. It comes home. And it'll let you know when it gets there. Now, once you establish that link back, then you can go ahead and proceed with your mission. Unless the battery gets low, it's out of sight, it knows to come home, and it'll do that. Search and rescue operations, there was a fire department captain, I believe, and I wanted to say Wichita, I believe. There was 2 kids out in a flooded river, were stuck on a rock, and they had rescue operations going on with the guys tried to get a raft to them to get them to safety. They couldn't get to them. So the chief, he's got his own personal unit. He pulls it out, paracord to the bottom of it with a tow line, and sends it to them. The guys take it off. They pull the life jackets and the raft to them. They get them in and back to safety. You know, 2 lives right there were saved with a $2,000, well, I wouldn't say a toy, but a tool, because you can get smaller ones that won't do that. But this is one of the things that, you know, law enforcement, search and rescue personnel can use. There's a Texas-based company that flies for one of the sheriff's office there. It's a big county, and they found 11 bodies. They were deceased, but they were able to locate and find 11 bodies. You know, that's closure for families. There's, of course, we have one guy in Kentucky that stated a drone was flying over his house taking pictures of his daughter and her friends by the swimming pool. He goes in the backyard with a 12 gauge, unloads on it, blows the drone out of the air. Took him about 5 rounds. All right, his complaint was the guy was flying right over top of his house, 10, 15 feet in the air, taking pictures of his kids. Well, these units keep a log. When they fly, everything's logged internally. The guy that was actually using it was video taking pictures of a house right next to his house for a friend that they were doing reconstruction. The log pulled out of that unit stated he was 198 feet and he never crossed the boundary of that yard, and the pictures confirm that. You know, problems with UAV pilots, the public using them, people with 333 exemptions know they got a pilot on hand, but now you got the public that doesn't understand flying over their houses. Yes, sir.
So the say that there's been a little bit of a different scenario, and he had flown over the individual's house, and he was doing it for other purposes than what he had stated.
Right.
Would the homeowner have been justified?
At 200 feet?
Camera?
Yeah.
Invading his privacy?
Well, see, we took some pictures at 25, 50, 7,500 feet. And 25 feet, you can discern, you can make out features. At 50 feet, not so much. At 75 feet, no. At 100 feet, you know there's somebody down there. So and I understand the guy probably didn't know, and it won't come up.
I thought we were talking about high definition cameras.
Well, yes, but these are they're not zoom lens. Now they do make a bigger one that you can hang a 60D Canon camera on with a zoom feature. But then again, you're looking at spending $10,000 on equipment. Who's going to spend that much money on equipment besides somebody that's going to do real estate, photography?
But it's very possible.
It's possible.
With all technology, as we go forward, prices are going to come down.
You're right.
Technology is going to get better.
Yeah. Right, yes, sir.
And if we're dealing with the legalities of it here,
And
we
you need to.
need to be thinking down the road, not just what's going on. right
Exactly.
Absolutely. As you can see, Sergeant Harden is very passionate about what he does. He could stay here all day and tell you that, and I know you've got way too much to do for us to be here that long. Unfortunately, the computer looked like it wouldn't play that. You do have a copy of that PowerPoint.
Yes.
On that, there are actual links there, which is what Sergeant Harden was saying. There's actual links to current video footage that has been obtained from people doing the very things you're talking about. But as he said earlier, with the new high def that's coming out, that is a concern that you're going to have to stay ahead of, because as the technology advances, they're going to get to the point to where, and I call it the paparazzi, they're going to have the ability to video things from very long distances by the use of UAVs. So Georgia should be up front putting some regulations and laws out there in order to deal with that. On a personal note, when we was talking a while ago about some of the FAA stuff, one of you touched on the fact that that is a civil remedy, and you're right. We need the ability, at least on the local level, to put laws in place to stop folks that are doing those things, like at the Atlanta Stadium, at Turner Field, or places like that, because although they are maybe just wanting to get good video footage, they're actually creating a disturbance at those areas. And law enforcement has got to have the ability to be able to respond to those people right then. Being able to contact FAA is almost an after-the-fact situation. So you really do need to make sure something's put in place to take care of that privacy issue. Is there any more questions, Mr. Chairman? We'll get out of your way.
Representative Prince.
Thanks, Sheriff Whittle
Yes, sir.
and Sergeant Darden for coming down and sharing this. And I tell you, my concern, and I think we all in this, definitely on the committee, but and also in the audience, can agree that this technology is something that that we have to use, and is beneficial. But as we go forward, we're going to need you guys' help. And I say you the blast guys for law enforcement, as well as the police chief, Mr. Vernon with the GBI, on what's the cost of enforcing whatever legislation, whatever rules or ordinances that you put out there. What's going to be the cost of enforcing that? We talked, police chief talked about the line of sight piece. The person should be somewhere nearby. But what's going to tell you? What are you using to say, okay, we know how to track this person? So I think it's going to be some type of cost going in, some type of technology, not so much to use it, but to enforce it. Another thing is, as we go forward, what is going to be the cost? Is there a cost savings for you now? Now you don't have to send 3 deputies out to roam this large area. You can use them a drone. Is there a cost savings? Are we going to need less personnel now on your staff?
Any law enforcement agency, the real cost is in your personnel.
Check.
Roughly 70% of your budget is always tied up in your manpower. And when we use the drones, it lowers the days of old. If we were searching for someone, we would form a skirmish line, and that takes a lot of officers to get that done in order to be able to cover that. This can cover the same kind of area with 1 or 2 operators, or at least an operator and an observer looking at those screens, that it could take 15 to 20 officers to do the days of old. So the technology is there for us to save money. It's also there to save money on crime scenes, on accident scenes. We use it to actually run a racetrack pattern around any of our major accidents that have serious bodily injury or death involved in it, because it's good evidence to go to court when we know we're always going to need that come court time. Same thing at crime scenes. It's just newer technology that we can use in order to save money. But Chief Keenan's folks were in my county not too long ago. One of the DNR officers was involved in a shooting in Columbia County a few weeks ago, and Mr. Keenan's crime scene folks came out there, and they've got one of the nicest pieces of technology. I'm jealous of it, to be honest with you, made by Leica. It's the, I don't even know what you call that thing. It is a standalone electronic thing that's got lasers on it. It's got cameras on it. When you set it up in a crime scene, it starts going in a 360 fashion, taking photos and making measurements of everything in the crime scene. And we're investigating that now ourselves because it is such a time saver. And these UAVs are in the same category as that. being able to put those up in the air and see things real time with one operator and one observer can save you hundreds of man hours that we normally spent just a year ago.
And I tell you, that's why I think we need to keep you guys close to us as we form this legislation, because not only that, the cost savings, we're going to need to see that, or some type of empirical data that shows what we could possibly save on the cost. But then as we think in the future, as Eddie was saying down there, we got to start thinking about traffic. I know right now we have roads, but as these technology becomes available, it becomes cheaper, more people are going to start buying it. So over here, I'm right in Richmond County next to you, so I understand what the lady Antipella, exactly. But now we start talking, and I'm talking traffic in the air now. How are we going to I know FAA has all these rules and all that, but how are we going to regulate that in local areas? And then on the appropriation side, I mean, maybe it's a license. Where do we start licensing users? If I go out and get a Walmart drone, do I have to have a license? So again, as we go down this road, we're going to be depending on you guys a lot for a lot of feedback on how we draft this legislation, because you guys are going to be the ones who have to enforce it, and we just want to make sure you have the tools to do that. That's all.
Thank you. And Sheriff, I appreciate you being here, appreciate your staff, and you hit on one of the things that concerns me is that we rely very heavily on the FAA now. Local law enforcement is very difficult sometimes to get them to respond. I think we heard this from the city of Atlanta, being able to have some things in the law that gives you the tools you need when you do have an issue, flying too close to the stadium, flying around a crime scene, flying on someone else's property and doing things they shouldn't be doing, that there's some laws in place that give you as a local sheriff the ability to take care of your public safety in your community without necessarily having to rely just on the FAA to do it at some later date. So.
Yes, sir. We've got to keep the privacy concerns of not only individuals but entities in Georgia. Just from our standpoint, talking a minute ago, Augusta every year is home of the Masters. Mm-hmm. I promise you that is a huge undertaking if you've never been there. I send officers from Columbia County to assist Richmond County because we simply don't have enough officers. If we start putting UAVs from the private sector into that mix over that crowd, that is a huge concern from the security standpoint, because that is a very target-rich environment. Masters is the home of probably the largest single group of financial people in the world at one given week. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge concern for security there. So there definitely needs to be laws in place to prevent that type of thing from taking place there at the Masters. And I'm sure the same thing here in Atlanta as far as the chief's concerned with all of the stadiums that he has to deal with here.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Yes, sir.
And Terry, you have anything else? All right, and thank you to the Georgia Sheriff Association, the chiefs of police, and to follow up on what Representative Prince says, whatever, if any, legislation we propose that comes out of this committee, we'll be working closely with you guys as we always do, and we appreciate you and Director Keenan and the law enforcement community for being here and always helping us get it right so that we don't have those unintended consequences, and that's the whole purpose of doing it in this fashion, so thank you. All right, to wrap us up before we go to any public comment, we have Chuck Spahas with the Prosecuting Attorneys Council to talk to us.
Thank you and good morning. Playing cleanup after y'all sat here for an hour and a half. I know I need to be brief. I'll go ahead and get started while Abby tries to get us back on board. I provided you two documents in your packet. One of them is a black and white of a PowerPoint that I'll go through right quick. Basically what Representative Tanner asked me to do was as I see it, we've really got two issues. The private use of these drones, which we've obviously all heard evidence today that there needs to be some serious conversation about regulating that use, and then law enforcement's use of it. So from a prosecutor standpoint, I'm just going to briefly hit you with the concepts of search and seizure related to this and what I believe the current rules are, and then I can go through right quick. There's a set of statutes that I provided to you that I believe does govern some behavior now. So you got to start with the premises of what does the Fourth Amendment protect. And it is the right of people to be secure in their persons, house, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures by the government, and shall not be violated, and no warrant shall be issued except by probable cause supported by oath or affirmation. So that's the general concept we're starting with, and obviously the Fourth Amendment does apply to law enforcement's use of drones. Okay, we're up now. But what about outside the home? I've cited several U.S. Supreme Court cases, but whatever a person exposes to the public, even in his own home or office, is not subject to Fourth Amendment protections. So that's where we get what's called the open fields doctrine. A person may not legitimately demand privacy for activities conducted out of doors except in areas immediately surrounding the home. So we've got a whole body of case law about what is the home and where do you have an expectation of privacy. The concepts of the curtilage or the area surrounding the home includes the yards, the grounds of a particular address, its gardens, barns, and buildings. Now, we've been given some instruction about how to analyze that, and whether or not a particular area surrounding a home would be protected by Fourth Amendment. It includes proximity to the area of the home, whether or not there's been an enclosure erected, whether or not, what is the nature and the use of that particular area, and has an individual taken steps to protect that area. I can give you an example of a case that I did about 20 years ago. We had gotten information that somebody was growing marijuana around a pool in a yard. And the the yard was fully enclosed with a privacy fence. We had good information, but it was actually from an individual that had provided services in the home. The bug man saw that there was marijuana growing around the pool and called us. When we went there, we observed quickly that the house is surrounded by a fence, but the house also backed up to a common area that belonged to an undeveloped part of that subdivision. And because of that, we actually were able to go around without getting on that property. And believe it or not, there was a missing slide of fence on the back side, and you could, with a pair of binoculars, see the marijuana growing in the yard. The reason I tell that story is we did go get a search warrant based on that, and we ended up in the Supreme Court over the search and seizure concepts of that. And what the court ruled was if you could see it and access it from an open field, then it was an acceptable search. Okay, here's what we do know. We have case law out there about fixed wing flyovers and aircrafts. We've had cases as high as 1,000 feet. We've had helicopter flyovers at altitude of 400 feet that did not violate the Fourth Amendment. And we've even got a Georgia case about 100 to 150 feet outside the curtilage. Remember, all of these cases have been about open fields, places where you don't have an expectation of privacy. We do have an interesting case out of the Supreme Court, though, the Dow Chemical case, where actually it was a mapping camera that they took from a long distance of a chemical plant where they found a violation. They went in there and they said that was admissible. But what I bring to your attention is in that Supreme Court case where they did allow it, they did make this statement, and it gives us some guidance maybe as to where they would go in the future. And it said that the use of highly sophisticated surveillance equipment not generally available to the public, such as satellite technology, may in fact require a search warrant. So we've got case law out there that says you can use binoculars to enhance your ability to see into a property or see if it is otherwise not protected. So that's admissible. So basically what I'm telling you is under current search and seizure concepts, law enforcement can use drones to search areas that they could otherwise permissibly search. So we'll start with that premise, and then I'll kind of tell you about, they clearly can't use them to go into homes. We've got case law out there about the concepts of using thermal imaging, for instance, without a search warrant. So it is required to have a search warrant to use that if you're going to infiltrate somebody's home. You've heard a lot of the legitimate reasons for using drones. I'm not going back through that. I do give you a few examples. This is a fatality wreck that the State Patrol was able to do an overhead with. And keep in mind what it's given us is the ability to get this kind of quality evidence in all of these cases now. In the past, maybe you could get a helicopter, maybe you couldn't, but this now allows us in almost any of those kinds of circumstances to do that. Major intersections where whatever transpired is at issue, you've got an aerial view as opposed to somebody just taking a photograph. This is another fatality crash where you obviously you've got a perspective that you would not have had in the past. And it's not just wrecks. This is a murder scene that was done at the request of GBI by the GSP drone, where the parking lot in question is where the murder took place, and the proximity of the parking spaces to the parking lot, to the door, that kind of thing were at question. And this obviously gives you a perspective that you've never had before. So let me conclude this aspect of it by saying the search and seizure concepts that we travel under now do apply to law enforcement use of drones. I heard the Columbia County Sheriff say that they get search warrants. I submit to you they're required to get search warrants. I don't believe that the technology available in the drone has given anybody any more authority to go into any place than we already had. So the use or the application of a search warrant to specifically go into an area where there's an expectation of privacy is required and has always been required and continues to be required. Also, let's talk a minute. I've also handed you something, and that concludes the PowerPoint side. I've given you something that says Georgia Code Crime and Offenses, and I just threw it together right quick to kind of give you an idea of what's on the books. This, for instance, 161162, it's called peeping toms because that's an old term, but if you look at the definition of peeping tom, it is any person who peeps through windows, doors, or other like places on the premises for the purposes of spying or invading the privacy of another person. That's a 1 to 5 felony now, whether you do it with binoculars, whether you climb up a ladder and look in the window, or whether you would use a drone. So there is statutes out there now that can be used when individuals violate somebody's private areas with these devices. 161162, I won't go through it, but I do read part of it to tell you that it prohibits any person from using a device without the consent of all persons observed to observe, photograph, or record the activities of another person which occur in a private place and out of public view. That is current status of the law. It is a felony to violate it, and there are exceptions in there, including law enforcement, but it's law enforcement's use during the normal course of their business, which means the concepts of search and seizure still apply. But there have been a few cases I've heard about today and yesterday where we've started to see some people charged with this concept. So there are. This is, if we were to go into the code, and I'm sure Ms. Travis and I will have this conversation at some point. We need to look where we currently have law prohibiting this kind of thing and enhance that. So, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Yeah, I've got just a couple. Talking about having to have a search warrant, you know, the case Florida v. Riley said that a helicopter flying over the defendant's curtilage at an altitude of 400 feet did not violate his Fourth Amendment right. So I guess that's my question would be is if you send a drone, right now, if I've got information that there's a marijuana grow in a backyard on Sassafras Street and I send a helicopter flying, or the helicopter's just out there flying and it sees it, I can use that information. And I believe that's would meet the standard. So would you have any issue, and based on the law enforcement testimony we heard today, I really didn't hear anything if we kept it restricted to say if you're going to go and you're going to be on the curtilage of someone's property with a drone, you have to have a search warrant unless there's extenuating circumstances.
I think if you're going there for that purpose to conduct a search, then to require a search warrant, I think most of us believe is required now. So to clarify that certainly does not offend any shape, form, or fashion what we're after. But I do believe you got to listen to some of the things that they've said about the common use of them and the inadvertent discovery, and we need to avoid that. I mean, what we don't want is we're legitimately looking for that missing child or that missing adult, and then while doing so, we discover a kidnapped child or something of that nature. Let's make sure that it's about the intended use and not the inadvertent discovery, that kind of thing.
Right. Are there any other questions? All right. You going to go with the other part? Or are you finished?
Just no. The other part was to give you the statutes there that's in front of you that talks about the behavior and show you that we do have some regulation on that behavior now.
Let me ask you a question on 161162. If you're going back to the helicopter incident, if I have a helicopter and I'm flying around, Vernon Keenan's a famous guy, and I'm flying around his place and I'm videotaping from a helicopter. Do you think could I be charged under 161162? Has there ever been any case law on that?
I can't answer the question off the top of my head about the case law. I will say this, based on this language in this statute, I believe if you take your helicopter and you see Vernon Keenan in a place that he has an expectation of privacy, and you do that for the purposes of photographing or observing his behavior, I do believe that you could violate this code section.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you. We have a few folks that have signed up to speak, so we will give them an opportunity. And some people sometimes mistake this list that they're not necessarily here to speak. So if you want to speak, come up. But O'Leary from CCLD Technologies.
I just want to say thank you. I think I did sign up on that by mistake, but I did have a couple things that I thought I could maybe add to that I saw mentioned. As far as I think trying to help law enforcement be able to control hobbyists in a sense would be maybe if parks and recreations can get involved somehow and create more flying areas. Right now, you got 1 million drones being sold expected at Christmas time. Where are these kids going to go? They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. They may not be familiar with airspace regulations at all. I mean, I wouldn't expect a 10-year-old to know anything about that. But if you told them you've got, 25 parks within a certain mile radius of you, they have a place to go. I mean, AMA, which is a hobbyist controlled air group, they put together flight parks all the time for people. But the problem is, in the Atlanta area, you've only got maybe 4 or 5 that people can access fairly easily. A lot of people aren't going to say, I've got this little hobby drone that can fly for 7 to 10 minutes. I'm going to go charge it for an hour and drive an hour to the flight park to fly for that 7 to 10 minutes. They're just going to pop it up in their neighborhood. It could come down in a neighbor's yard, or, different things could happen. So I think if we could maybe figure out a way to try to work with parks and recreations to help develop parks into more flying zones, it could take away from some of the cost that law enforcement has to put out to try to enforce this. So, also speaking on the LiDAR-based technology for crime scene, they do have terrestrial LiDAR, which is a laser technology that was being discussed before that can document all the area of a crime scene, maybe a murder scene or accident, whatever, with millimeter accuracy. We're starting to be able to get this type of information onto these type of sensors on board of the UAVs, which would give you more perspective, more data collection capabilities to help with crime scene documentation. It can also be used in surveying, mapping, stuff for DOT. So it's really useful in that aspect. You can do what we're kind of dubbing as remote engineering. You don't have to send so many boots on the ground out to an area to do survey work or to do any kind of information gathering that you could just do with a UAV pilot and get all the same millimeter accuracy measurements that you would with a regular ground crew doing survey work. And then a really big thing that I'd like to see happen between private sector and law enforcement would be some sort of a way to come together. Right now, the FAA can help us UAV pilots in the sky, but not on the ground. So if I'm on the ground and I'm doing my launch and takeoff, of course, you have to come from the ground and you have to come back to the ground. And right now, law enforcement can actually get involved and prosecute, and arrest or charge you for being in a no drone zone or a no fly zone because you took off from somewhere that you weren't authorized to. You were allowed to be in the air, you were allowed to be able to conduct the flight, but you weren't supposed to really maybe take off from that spot. So if there's a way that we can kind of connect the companies doing this type of stuff with law enforcement, so that maybe there could be an established way of notifying law enforcement that we're going to be doing activities in these certain areas, and that they're open to the process and already aware of how it would be handled. There's nothing in place right now. Like they were talking before with the COAs, once you have a 333 exemption, which CCLD Technologies, the company I work for, does, if we want to fly, we simply put in a COA, notice to airmen, let them know we're going to be in the area, what we're going to be doing, maps, sectionals, everything. I have nothing to submit to law enforcement to let them know this is where I'm taking off from. Are you guys okay with that? Or where would you like to see me take off from to do the work on this area here? So I think that would be a big thing too. Just little things that I think would help free them up to do their normal daily activities and not be bogged down by all this new drone stuff. And like I said, I think I signed up on that list by mistake, but that's all I really had.
Good. Well, it's good comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Alex Bradford with Georgia Farm Bureau.
Wrong list.
All right. Colette with DOT, wrong list or right list?
No, actually.
Good.
I actually wear 3 hats. I currently work for Georgia DOT in the aviation program. I was in the airport management sector for 13 years, was at the Brunswick-Old Niles Airport, St. Simons Island, and then I was at Savannah Hilton Head International, and I'm also a commercial pilot. So I have all the different aspects when it comes to UAS. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the department, but from the airport sector, Georgia Airports Association unfortunately couldn't be here because they have their annual conference this week. But going down there to see them after this meeting, sorry, I don't know why I'm nervous. But one of the things that airports, their concerns are is the UAS operating, in the airport airspace. There's only 12 airports in Georgia that have air traffic control towers that can actually tell the airplanes where to go and do that see and avoid. Other than that, the other general aviation airports don't have that control. So then you have UAS out there that are operating in that airspace, and those airports may not know that they're there. And so and those aircraft may not know that they're there because there's no one telling them that they're there. So they can have an issue of a collision factor. And just being a pilot and having friends that are in the airline industry, there's just concerns of, when I was at Savannah, we had 2 drone sightings on approach by JetBlue. So there's just concerns from the commercial side of it, too, that there could be issues. So that's all I really had to say.
All right. Thank you very much. Last person on the list may have got on the list by mistake, too. I think there was CCLD, Jim Kelly. You have anything to add? Okay. Is there anyone else here that wishes to be heard? All right. If not, anything else from the... Oh, come on up, sir. Just come around. Just give us your name and speak to us from the microphone, please.
My name's Byron Hilley. I'm an attorney in Marietta, and I've got an interest in this primarily from the standpoint of easements and access over residential property in the 500-foot zone that actually belongs to the landowner, and whether or not operation of UAVs within that area is a trespass. I think it's certainly a civil trespass. I haven't looked at whether or not it constitutes a criminal trespass, and you may want to look at that as well. One thing that concerns me as I've gotten into this and started listening to it, and with the fact that I think Walmart predicts they're going to sell 1 million UAVs over the Christmas season. I think the price is between about $50 and $250 for the ones they sell, which are recreational or hobbyist drones. But one thing that concerns me is once there's a proliferation of them, and unlike the radio control planes or the planes, model airplanes that people had in the 50s that ran off a gasoline engine and took some technological skill to actually get in the air and control where you couldn't get them very far without crashing them if you didn't know what you were doing. The new ones are controlled with smartphones and various other devices that are, although not quite idiot-proof, they're very easy to use. And what concerns me is, for example, if once there's a proliferation of them, you've got people breaking into houses that may take them and play with them for a while. And these may be the same type of people that throw rocks off interstate bridges. They may take them out to the interstate and easily put it through the windshield of a truck or a car just to see what it could do, when they get tired of playing with it themselves, because it's a stolen drone. And, I think anybody that watched the news last night saw there were some people throwing rocks, I think, on 285 that went through some windshields. And I think we need to restrict these things near interstates and near highways where they could literally be very deadly for somebody that was intending to use them in that fashion. So I think the DOT might want to address that, as well as law enforcement. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much, sir. Anyone else? All right, if not, thank you all for being here. Our next meeting, we'll get out to you. I want to talk with Senator Hill. We're planning a joint meeting with the Senate Finance folks to look at ways that we can incentivize and increase this industry here in the state. As we've all heard, it's very much a growing industry, and although we need to put some regulations in place to protect public safety, it's also an area that we can grow a growing industry here in Georgia and bring jobs to Georgia. So we'll be getting that information out, making sure it fits with everyone's schedule. If there's nothing else, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you.